The letter arrived the same week she did. Nobody in Oregon City knew what to do with either of them. It sat on the corner of a neighbor's table, a folded square of paper sealed with pale wax, addressed in a woman's careful hand to a man named Thomas Alcott, while Ruth Mercer stood in the October mud outside what was supposed to have been her future, and tried to understand what the neighbor was telling her. She had crossed 2,100 miles. She had left Zanesville, Ohio on a Tuesday in April with 2 trunks, a Bible, and 6 letters she had read so many times the paper was wearing thin at the folds. She had buried a mule at the Platte River crossing, and her best pair of shoes somewhere in the Blue Mountains, and what remained of her composure at a creek in southern Idaho that had no name on any map she'd seen. She had walked the last 300 miles on foot because the wagon couldn't bear the weight. Thomas Alcott had been in the ground since March. She did not scream. She did not fall. She stood in the mud with her remaining trunk at her feet and looked at the house he had been building. Rough-hewn lumber, 2 rooms, a porch with no railing yet, and she thought, very quietly, that it was a good-looking house. That was the first thing. The second thing she thought was that she had nowhere to go. Ruth Mercer was 34 years old in the spring of 1857, and she had already spent one life. She had been a schoolteacher in Zanesville for 11 years, which was long enough for most of her students to grow up and begin having children of their own, who she then taught in turn. She rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who kept too many cats and a habit of commenting on Ruth's meals. She was not unhappy exactly. She was simply living on the edge of a life that had been intended for someone slightly larger than herself. Someone who had married at 20, who had a house and a garden, and a name that was her own, and not borrowed from a father who had died the same winter as the man she had almost married 12 years before. The man she had almost married at 22 was called James. He had died of typhoid in December of 1845 and taken with him any urgency Ruth felt about building a future. She had settled instead into the particular competence of a woman who has stopped waiting and started simply living. And there was dignity in it, and there was loneliness in it. And on most days she could not have told you which was heavier. Thomas Alcott had written to her through a mutual acquaintance, a cousin of a cousin, the kind of introduction that required 3 degrees of separation and a Sunday dinner to arrange. His first letter arrived in October of 1855. He was 41. He had gone west 3 years earlier with a partner who had since returned to Pennsylvania for reasons the letter did not specify. Thomas had stayed. He had 160 acres in the Willamette Valley, a claim filed proper, a creek on the north edge of the property that ran clear enough to drink from in summer. He was building a house. He was a man of regular habits, he wrote, moderate temperament and Presbyterian faith. He did not want a young woman. He wanted, he said with a plainness she found almost startling after years of carefully worded nothing, a partner. Someone who had already done some of the hard work of living and wasn't frightened of it. Ruth had written back the same evening. They exchanged 6 letters over 18 months. She learned that he had come from Western Virginia, that he had never married, that he had a humor he kept close and only let out in short bursts on the page, that he preferred the silence of early morning to any other hour of the day. He learned that she taught the 3rd and 4th grades, that she could bake a serviceable pie but not a beautiful one, that she had read more books than most men she'd met and had opinions about all of them, that she was not sentimental about Ohio. The 6th letter arrived in January of 1857. He asked her to come in the spring. She spent 6 weeks putting her affairs in order. Her resignation from the school, her departure from Mrs. Pratt's house, the sale of what furniture she owned, and the careful packing of what remained. She wrote to him in April, the week before she was to leave, to say she was coming. She sealed the letter with pale wax and put it in the post and did not look back at it. She did not know that Thomas Alcott had been dead for 3 weeks by the time her letter left Zanesville. The wagon train Ruth joined was called the Hensley Party, organized out of Independence, Missouri, and departing the 14th of May, 1857. There were 31 wagons and 112 people, and Ruth knew none of them when she climbed up onto the seat of a borrowed wagon beside a family named Goss, husband, wife, 4 children between the ages of 3 and 11, who had agreed to let her travel with them in exchange for help with the children and $2 a week toward provisions. She had been afraid of this part. Not the trail itself. She had read enough to know what the trail would ask of her. But this, the beginning of it, the stepping into a crowd of strangers and finding her place among them. She was a woman alone, which was not unusual on the trail, but was never entirely comfortable. And she was traveling toward a specific man at a specific piece of land, which made her feel both more purposeful and more exposed than the families around her who were simply traveling toward the idea of somewhere better. She kept Thomas's 6 letters in her coat pocket. Not all of them, that would have been foolish, but the last 2, which she had memorized anyway and carried now the way some women carried a rosary, for the weight of them more than any specific comfort. The first weeks on the trail were nothing like she expected, which is to say they were harder and duller simultaneously. The Platte River Road through Nebraska was flat enough to see for 20 miles in any direction, which ought to have been reassuring and was instead merely enormous. The grass was good in May, still green and thick, and the oxen moved steadily enough, but the wagons creaked in a way that suggested they were always on the edge of something giving way, and the dust from 31 wagons ahead of her coated the inside of her mouth by mid-morning and did not leave until she slept. She helped Mrs. Goss with the children in the evenings. She learned to start a cook fire in wind that wanted to put it out. She learned to sleep on ground that was always slightly harder than she remembered from the night before. She learned that the woman 2 wagons ahead of her, a Mrs. Deline from Indiana, had been on this same trail once before and turned back at Fort Laramie when her youngest took sick and was trying again now with the same youngest, who was 7 and healthy and seemed not to know he was a second attempt. She learned that a man named Caleb Marsh was traveling 6 wagons behind her with a daughter of 9 named Clara, and that Mrs. Marsh had died of fever the previous winter in Kansas City, and that Caleb Marsh did not talk about this, but Clara did, with the matter-of-fact grief of a child who has decided that carrying the story is the only thing she can do with it. Clara had attached herself to Ruth by the 2nd week, appearing at the Goss wagon each morning to walk alongside her, asking questions with the focused intensity of a child who has been thinking all night and saved everything up for the walk. She asked Ruth why she was going to Oregon. Ruth told her she was going to meet someone. Clara asked if she loved him. Ruth said she thought so. Clara asked how you knew. Ruth said she was still working that out. At mile 575, they passed Chimney Rock. It rose out of the Nebraska plains like something that had no business being there. A spire of pale tan rock climbing 325 feet out of flat ground, visible for 20 miles before they reached it and 20 miles after they left it behind. Ruth had read about it in every account of the trail she could find, and she had expected to feel something when she saw it. But what she felt was not what she expected. She felt very suddenly and completely that she was real, that this was real, that she was not reading about someone else's journey but was standing inside one of her own, and that the woman who had rented a room from Mrs. Pratt and taught 3rd grade in Zonnesville was already someone she was remembering from a distance. She wrote in her diary that evening, "Chimney Rock today. It is exactly as described and nothing like described. I feel I have passed some kind of marker, though not a geographical one." 14 miles east of Fort Laramie, a man named Henderson who had ridden ahead and back for provisions told the wagon captain that there was fever at the fort. Not cholera, or not yet confirmed as cholera, but 6 men sick and 1 woman and the post surgeon seeing cases daily. The captain made the decision to stop half a mile short, take on what water they could from a tributary of the Laramie River, and continue with minimal time inside the fort's walls. Ruth did not go into the fort. She sat in the wagon with Clara, who had taken to riding with the Gosses in the afternoon heat, and she read to the child from a copy of Pilgrim's Progress that Clara found deeply confusing and Ruth found, on reflection, not entirely comforting either. It was here, in the half-camp outside Fort Laramie, that she heard the name Thomas Alcott for the first time spoken by someone other than herself, the man who said it was a trader named Fitch making his return east with a mule train who stopped to exchange news with some of the wagon men. Ruth was close enough to hear, and she did not pretend otherwise. She stood and listened while Fitch mentioned, in passing, that he'd wintered near Oregon City, that he knew several of the settled men in the valley, that a fellow named Alcott had come down with something bad in the early spring. He couldn't say more than that, hadn't been there himself, had it second-hand from a man at Fort Bridger. Ruth felt the information enter her body the way cold water enters when you step into a stream, all at once, not gradually. She asked Fitch directly. She walked up to him while he was still talking, and she said, "Excuse me," she said, "Thomas Alcott. Can you tell me what you know?" Fitch looked at her. He said he didn't know much. He said he'd heard the man was poorly. He said this with the vagueness of someone who knows more than he's saying and has decided the woman in front of him doesn't need all of it. That night, Ruth sat in the wagon with the canvas down, and Thomas's last letter open in her lap, and she made herself read it straight through. His handwriting was not elegant. It tilted to the left, which she had always found endearing, as though the words were leaning toward something. "The house is coming along," he had written. "The south room is finished, and the north room wants only a floor. I expect to have it ready before summer. I expect a great deal of things before summer," she told herself. Second-hand from a man at Fort Bridger. She told herself, poorly does not mean gone. She told herself, 2,000 miles for second-hand from a man at Fort Bridger. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket, and in the morning she told the Gosses she was ready to move. South Pass came on a Thursday in late July, and it was nothing like a mountain crossing ought to have been. The pass sat at 7,412 feet above sea level, the highest point on the entire trail, the Continental Divide, and it arrived so gently that some in the party did not realize they had crossed it until the wagon master told them at the evening camp. The land simply tilted, almost imperceptibly, and they were on the other side of the continent. Ruth stood at the marker the wagon master pointed out, a rough pile of stones, no formal sign, and she looked west and she thought, "I am closer to him now than to anything I left behind. Everything on this side of the divide runs to the Pacific." There was something absolute about it that she had needed. She had been carrying the word poorly for 3 weeks like a stone in her shoe, and standing at South Pass she made herself put it down. She was not naive, but she was also 5 weeks from Oregon City, and there was nothing to be done about any of it except to walk. That evening, Caleb Marsh came to sit near the Goss fire without particular invitation. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but self-contained in a way that Ruth recognized as the particular self-containment of grief. He had learned to move through space carefully, to not take up too much of it, as though he was still apologizing for whatever had happened. He sat and he said nothing useful, and then Clara appeared from somewhere and curled up against his side and went half asleep, and he put his hand on the child's head with a gentleness so unguarded that Ruth had to look away. He said, eventually, "You heard something at Fort Laramie." She said yes. He said, "I'm sorry." She said she didn't know yet if there was anything to be sorry about. He said, "No." He said, "You're right." They sat for a while longer without talking, and the fire burned down, and Clara slept, and Ruth thought that she had not said any of this aloud to anyone until tonight, and that there was something both terrifying and relieving about having said it. The way lancing a wound is both terrible and necessary. They lost 2 people in Idaho. The first was a child, the Hendersons' youngest, 4 years old, who had been sick since the Snake River crossing at mile 1037 and died quietly in the night 6 days after. The family buried him on the north bank of the Snake without ceremony, which is to say the ceremony was entirely internal, which is the worst kind. The second was Mr. Goss's lead ox, which broke a leg on Sharp Rock and had to be shot before dawn on a Wednesday, and though an ox is not a person, the loss reorganized everything. The weight distribution, the pace, the conversation, they were one animal short of what the wagon needed. They redistributed and slowed. Ruth began walking full days by then. Most of the women did. The mountains were coming and the animals needed relief. The Blue Mountains of Oregon arrived in September, and they were not like South Pass. They were exactly what a mountain crossing was supposed to be. Steep, relentless, the trail carved into switchbacks that seemed to have been designed by someone who had never pulled a wagon up one. The temperature dropped 20 degrees from the foothills to the first ridge. The wagon wheels screamed on the downhill grades. Ruth walked with her hands braced against the wagon's rear gate on the descents, and pushed from behind on the climbs, and her shoes, the second best pair, the first having been sacrificed somewhere in Idaho, began to separate at the sole on the third day. She tied them shut with a strip of canvas. Caleb found her doing this at the lunch stop on the fourth day in the mountains. He looked at the shoes. He looked at her. He said nothing, which she had come to understand was how he communicated concern. He went to his wagon and came back with a piece of leather he had been saving for harness repair, and spent 20 minutes cutting it into a shape that would reinforce her sole, working in the focused silence of a man who is very good at practical things and finds gratitude in them. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Thank you, Caleb." It was the first time she had used his given name. He didn't say anything to that either. But when he handed the shoes back, there was something in his face that she filed away, as carefully as she had once filed Thomas's letters, and did not examine again until much later. They came down out of the Blue Mountains on the 22nd of September, 1857, and the Willamette Valley opened below them like something from a different world entirely. The grass was still green. They had come far enough south and west for that, and the sky had cleared after 3 days of rain, and the light was the particular gold of early autumn, low and long and generous. Several people in the party wept. Ruth did not weep. She stood on a ridge and looked at the valley and felt the thing she had been carrying for 5 months rearrange itself into something she could not yet name. They reached the Dalles on the 1st of October. The party disbanded here, some taking the Columbia River route, some the Barlow Road south. The Gosses were going north toward the Tualatin Valley. Ruth was going south, to a piece of land 12 miles outside Oregon City that she knew from Thomas's description. Creek on the north edge, good soil, 160 acres, a house he'd been building. Caleb Marsh was also going south. He did not make a point of this. He simply said, when the party separated, that he and Clara were heading to a piece of land near Oregon City, and if Ruth was going the same direction, there was no reason to walk separately. She said yes without overthinking it. They walked the last 4 days together, Clara between them most of the time, asking the questions she had saved up for the mountains and the valley and every stretch of road she'd been too tired to talk through. Ruth answered what she could. Caleb answered what Clara directed at him, and on the third day, when Clara had exhausted herself into sleep in the back of the wagon, Caleb said, quietly, "What are you expecting when you get there?" Ruth said, "A man. A house he's been building. A piece of land on a creek." He said, "What if it isn't that?" She looked at him. She said, "I have been asking myself that since Fort Laramie." He said, "And," she said, "and I don't have an answer yet, but I'm almost there. So I suppose I'll find out." He nodded. He drove the wagon. After a while he said, "I hope it's what you're expecting." She said, "So do I." Neither of them said what was underneath that. The neighbor's name was Harlan Foss. He was a large, uncomfortable man who became more uncomfortable the moment Ruth introduced herself and watched his face do the calculation she had been dreading since Fort Laramie. He said, "You'd better come inside." He said, "I'm real sorry, Miss Mercer." Thomas Alcott had died on the 8th of March, 1857. Pneumonia set in after a cold winter and a wet February. He had been sick for 10 days and had known toward the end that he was not going to recover. He had asked Harlan Foss to see to the property and to write to a woman in Ohio named Ruth Mercer to tell her not to come. Harlan had written the letter. He had addressed it to the school in Zanesville, not knowing her home address. The letter had arrived after Ruth had already given her resignation. The school had forwarded it to Mrs. Pratt's house. By the time it arrived at Mrs. Pratt's house, Ruth had been on the trail for 6 weeks. She was halfway across Nebraska when the letter arrived, explaining she didn't need to come. Harlan Foss brought it out from a drawer in his kitchen. He handed it to her. She held it without opening it. He also brought out another letter. This one she recognized immediately. Her own handwriting. Her own pale wax seal. Her April letter. The one she had written from Zanesville the week before she left. "I am coming," she had written. "I expect to arrive by October." The letter had reached Harlan Foss's house, the closest working address for the Alcott claim, 2 days before Ruth arrived herself. She sat with both letters in her hands for a long time. Harlan Foss, to his credit, did not speak. He simply kept the kettle hot and let her sit. The house was exactly as Thomas had described it. 2 rooms, rough-hewn lumber, the south room finished and the north room wanting only a floor. The porch had no railing yet. The creek on the north edge of the property ran clear and cold in the October air. It was a good-looking house on good land, and there was no one in it, and it belonged to no one now until the county worked out the claim, and Ruth Mercer had come 2,100 miles to stand in front of it in the afternoon light with a letter she'd written to a dead man still sealed in her hand. She opened it. She read what she had written. She read the hope in it, the careful excitement, the one line where she had let herself say something like, "I think we may do well together, Thomas. I have thought so for some time now." She folded it back along its creases. She thought about what Caleb had asked her. What if it isn't that? She had not had an answer then. She found she had one now, though it was not a complete one. What she knew was this. She had walked 2,000 miles and she had not broken. She had buried a mule and her best shoes and 5 months of ordinary life, and she had kept walking. She was standing in a valley that was, she could already feel it, hers in some way that had nothing to do with a man or a claim or a letter. The air was different here. The light was different. She breathed in and it went down differently, all the way down. She did not know where she would sleep that night. Caleb Marsh appeared at the edge of the property around 4 in the afternoon. Clara slightly behind him, both of them reading her face from a distance. She watched him understand what had happened. She watched him make a decision about how to approach it. She could see him choosing his words, and then Clara broke away from him and ran to Ruth the way children run, without calculation, and put her arms around Ruth's middle and held on. Ruth put her hand on the child's head. Caleb stopped a few feet away. He said, "I'm sorry, Ruth." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" She said, "Not yet." He said, "Clara and I have a claim 3 miles east. There's a second room that's livable. It isn't much, but it isn't nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was going gold and long. The creek made a sound she could just hear from here. A low, steady murmur, like something talking to itself. She said, "I appreciate that, Caleb." He said, "You don't have to decide anything. Just come tonight." She looked back at the house one more time. She thought of Thomas's handwriting, tilting to the left. She thought of 6 letters worn thin at the folds. She thought of Mrs. Pratt's cats and the 3rd grade in Zanesville, and the particular loneliness of a life lived at the edge of itself. She picked up her trunk. She said, "All right, tonight." Clara took her free hand without being asked. They walked east along a dirt road in the October light, and Ruth did not look back, and the letter she had carried 2,000 miles she left folded on Harlan Foss's table, not because she had forgotten it, but because she was finished carrying it. It had gotten her here. That was enough. That was everything, in the end. She wrote in her diary that night, "By the light of a candle in a rough-built room in a stranger's claim. Arrived today. It was not what I expected. I am not sure yet what it is, but the valley is very beautiful, and I have decided I am staying." She underlined the last 3 words. Then she blew out the candle and slept without dreaming for the first time in 5 months.